voices to represent dreams, some text work where we adapted The Tempest in a piece that we called This Island's Mine, in which Miranda was the central character, and some creative work using labyrinths. So while the workshops are ongoing in the other schools, we're actually continuing to work at Limpsfield Grange, developing more educational resources. So for example, next term, we're going to be focusing on music, movement and sound installation. So that's the toolkit. COVID meant we had to revise the programme radically and develop online materials that could be used in schools or at home, whereby we would do the workshops through Zoom. Now, we talk in the project about happy accidents, and I think we've actually been really fortunate to have had the opportunity to focus on adapting the workshops as online resources, because I think it might actually be really preferable for a lot of our participants. It means they can do the activities in their own time with privacy before they're then involved in group work, and they can choose whether or not to do that. We've worked with the creative media company C&T, who've developed a special platform called Proskro for interactive creative educational resources. So each workshop is a smart script, and we've developed 6 smart scripts that will be the basis for the work in schools going forward. So those smart scripts, which is how we've distilled all the research now, are creativity, masks, puppetry, story making, design and action art. And in each smart script, we identify different ways of exploring our research questions. So what I'd like to do now, if it's okay, Catherine, is actually hand over to Emma and Hannah to talk as psychologists about their contribution to that creative practice. Great, thank you.
Hello. So yeah, Emma and I are working with the girls doing a series of testing. There were a series of paper tests that we did with them that included things to assess their mental well-being, the quality of life and self-perception. We also conducted 2 interviews that formed the basis of the words that you heard in the film. We interviewed them about how they make sense of themselves and their experiences of the world, and this included questions about what being autistic meant to them. Some of the words that you heard were from the girls in our pilot project, and as the process was iterative, so we kept adapting and changing, we brought in more of a focus on the sensory elements, and this was based on something that the girls kept referring to in these interviews, and I'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay, so at our partner school, Limpsfield Grange, where we ran the pilot for the study, we took part in some of the creative workshops that Nikki's talked about. So as part of the project's transdisciplinary approach, the arts researchers and psychology researchers made real efforts to share, engage in and reflect on each other's practices. And through participating in some of these workshops, we came to realise how different the girls were in that setting compared to how they were when we were interviewing them. So they really came alive in the workshops, whereas in the interviews, they seemed much more reserved and wary of us. So I would compare it to like the differences between a butterfly pinned to a specimen board and a butterfly flying around free. And we realised the girls might have been feeling rather like specimens pinned to a board, being examined under a magnifying glass when we were interviewing them. So what we did was to bring some of the arts practice into the interviews. So for example, if they wanted to, we got the girls to do some drawing tasks relating to the question content and to talk around those. We also developed, for example, a mind map to help document their sensory profiles. And we think that sort of thing, as well as we had biscuits and fruit on hand, that allowed the girls to focus on something other than us. And I think it facilitated engagement between us and encourage the girls to tell us more about their stories while we listen to them, rather than us seeming to interrogate them. So we think that helped us get richer and more authentic interviews.
So from these pilot interviews, as I mentioned earlier, we realised that the girls' sensory relationship to the world impacted greatly on their experiences. And so we began to incorporate questions surrounding this. Their sensory experience was a much greater influence on their daily lives than we had anticipated. For example, some girls talked about how they had a very strong physical reaction to their senses, like feeling physically sick or getting headaches. And for others, this impacted on their social experience. So one girl talked about being unable to eat with her family and friends because of the strong sensory experience associated to eating, in particular the sound of chewing food. And a lot of the sensory issues surrounding food were not only that the girls had intense dislikes of the taste, but it was also the texture of the food. And that's why we wanted to highlight this section within the film that you saw. And also something else to note, there were observations that a few of the girls had sensory difficulties with paper, and this impacted on their ability to do schoolwork, so including handling reading books, which disrupted what they were able to do in school. And I think this is a really important thing that schools should be aware of. Another surprising finding that we found throughout interviewing these girls was the diversity of the sensory experiences with the girls. Some girls had very intense sensory reactions, whereas other girls didn't appear to have issues that stood out to them or were perceived as a problem to themselves. And there was also individual diversity, where one sense would be hugely problematic for a girl, but another would cause them no issue.
Okay, so picking up on that issue of diversity that Hannah just talked about, that was something we really wanted to capture in the film, because there were some very different stories from the girls. So, for example, you saw in the film one girl, insists, this is who I am. Other people have just got to accept me, and there's the door if you don't. And that contrasts markedly with the girl who makes real efforts to hide their autistic identity, fearing being stigmatized and not accepted because of it. So there were some very different stories, but at the same time, there were common recognizable underlying patterns. For example, such as the challenges of certain sensory issues, which Hannah talked about, and also ongoing concerns about how best to fit in, which perhaps isn't surprising given the age of the girls. So even the girl who told other people, there's the door if you don't accept me, she made compromises to fit in. For example, she chose to wear a skirt rather than trousers, which she would have preferred, because the other girls wore skirts. So overall, we found some sort of anxious ambivalence in the girls towards their autistic identity. And this in part could be due to the mixed messages they receive from society about autism and gender, the fact they may not look autistic to other people, and perhaps a lack of access to positive role models.
Great, so some really interesting early findings coming through. Melissa, can I just turn to you to ask you about the workshops themselves, because they were, quite a finely constructed creative product, I'd say. Unmute, Melissa.
Sorry about that. Yeah, the participatory arts workshops, what we did in them, we were using this creative arts practice really to find out about the lives and experiences of the girls. And I was thinking generally what was not so good was talking too much, fire alarms, they were not very good, leading questions, too much focus on individuals. And what worked better overall were things like, silence actually sometimes worked very well, perhaps saying less. The fact there was no right or wrong in those workshops. Photos of their work were important, and sometimes like using selfies instead of mirrors for things like masks and puppets. Time, oh yes, so important, giving time to people. And the chill out spaces that we provided, that the girls could go into when they wanted to, just in the corner of the workshop, and the availability of stimmy toys. And I'm sitting here doing this, I like doing it. That those kind of STEM toys and tools were important. So we took a kind of ecological approach. We asked ourselves, what's an autistic space? Thinking about the whole environment around the girls in the workshops. And the sensory element is really vital, and it stops this kind of what we call hot cognition, this instant defensive reactions and responses all the time, and the high anxiety. And the triggers for anxiety are sometimes quite hard to predict. So although you need a logical structure for the workshops, and that needs to be communicated to the girls, you also have to stay very, very, very flexible and responsive. And and it means choosing the right activities. But I think a really important thing is the choice that the girls are given. You've got to give choices. So that girls sometimes chose to document the work with the camera rather than join in, and that was fine. So it's a kind of responsive, organic process. So I'm a designer and maker and puppeteer, and I'd like to talk really briefly about two specific workshops, if I've got time, have I, Catherine?
You've got 3
All right.
minutes.
3 minutes, great. Puppetry and den making, and I'm going to talk about them just in the one context, which was Limpsfield Grange. And there the girls were so individual, but also so very rich in the creativity and the imagination that they showed. The puppetry, well, the girls were slightly younger, both in actual age and sometimes perhaps in attitudes, than the secondary school pupils we worked with later. And actually, we used full-size paper puppets there, and in that context, that material was not a problem for them. And we were we were quite unexpectedly presented with a number of cat puppets. All the puppets seemed to have cat ears and whiskers and tails, but that was great. That kind of prompted a lot of discussion with them about them liking cats and why they'd made cats and so on. And I have to say that really all my careful efforts at communicating puppeteering skills about how to animate them were really rather irrelevant, because really the girls seized hold of these puppets as kind of companions and friends, and they immediately took them up to the boarding area at Limpsfield Grange. And when we visited the following week, these puppets were kind of ensconced in the beds and on the settees, and they'd been dragged along to TV watching sessions and the snack sessions and so on. So those puppets had really kind of enriched the imaginative play of the girls. And the other workshop, briefly, I want to mention is the den making, because that's so important to this environment that I mentioned earlier. This workshop uses ropes and drapes and pegs and cardboard and so on, and the girls are invited to make their own spaces. They can do it individually, or they can do it in pairs or in groups. The individuals tended to make spaces that were really cozy and lovely inside, with fairy lights and cushions and so on. And the groups tended to be the younger ones who would use it as places of play, and they would make cardboard furniture and cardboard televisions, and they used the puppets as the inhabitants of these spaces. So they all enjoyed it, and they had a real freedom to make the space that they wanted, in which they felt kind of safe and relaxed.
It kind of
So
makes me want
Nikki,
to go into one of those spaces myself.
oh,
I
they were great.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
they sound amazing. I need to move
yeah.
us on, I'm afraid, but Sonia, I'd really love to bring you in here because you have worked documenting the project, but also you got very, very involved in creating the film. And can you talk a little bit about the process of creating the film and what that was like for you as a visual artist, kind of switching roles?
Yes, I think it happened very organically. So Nikki did bring me onto the project as a film artist. I was very clear that I'm not a filmmaker or a documentary filmmaker, but I was there partly documenting. And I just found that it was such a rich environment, and in all kinds of different ways. It felt eventually kind of more logical, really, to start responding as an artist than as a documentarian. And what's been really fascinating for me personally and enriching is that I've learned so much from observing the girls, being part of the film making sort of on the day during workshops, starting up conversations, being part of interactions where they've taken the camera off me and started, documenting and directing themselves. But I think being behind the lens and observing, which really was my role, so I wasn't a participant in the workshops, I didn't create the content for the workshops, although I was around those discussions quite often. Was just the ability to observe and take footage, which I could later look at home on my, sort of editing software, and really engage with quite deeply. And just to be really sort of able to see details of interactions and observe the girls. You know, sometimes I could tell if they were masking, sometimes I could tell if they were uncomfortable, sometimes I could tell if they were genuinely enjoying something. And I felt like I was getting a real insight, which again made me reflect on my own experiences as a undiagnosed autistic schoolgirl.
I wanted to ask you about that,
Yeah.
because actually, you know, like me, you grew up as an autistic girl, but you didn't know you were an autistic girl. What was it like? What did you learn watching autistic girls in action who knew they're autistic girls as well? But was there a lot of similarity? Did you see differences? I'm kind of fascinated to dig into that.
Yeah, I think obviously their self-knowledge and the fact being in a specialist school would make it very different. And I was very conscious of that, but I was actually quite surprised at a lot of the sensory challenges, just even because the workshops at that point before COVID were being run in a gym at Limpsfield Grange with quite tricky acoustics and sometimes lighting, and you know, the team were doing a lot to try and work around those sensory issues. And some of the workshops were actually designed, you know, with curtains to try and shut out some of the light, and you know, with a great awareness of sound and the effect of that. But I was just, I guess, very conscious of the degree to which, even when you're in a specialist environment, let's say, you still have to deal with the building and you still have to mask, because in particular, I was there in some of the early workshops where the team were getting to know the girls and the girls were getting to know the team. And it was this sort of co-creation, but right at the beginning, and this sort of slight awkwardness where ideas were being tested out. And I just think I sort of recognized so much that having to mask. And in fact, one of the films that I created for the project is around that sense of girls very carefully mirroring their environment and the people in them to try and rub along, which was what I felt I was seeing and recognizing from my own experience. So I found it really deep and very enriching to my own practice.
We could all do with that learning experience.
Definitely.
And how did that kind of then reflect itself in the short film that we saw? Like, what did you draw on there that you took into that creative product? That's not a terrible phrase. Yes,
well,
it was,
and that was, I mean, that was another incredibly enriching experience. So the writing team spent a lot of time together during a very short space of time. We met on Zooms, obviously, because it was COVID. And we had very intense conversations around the writing. And I was very sort of aware and respectful indeed of the perspectives of all the different people who'd been in the room and been part of designing this extraordinary project. And it just felt like a real labor of love. So I think what I brought from having been on the ground was this sense of having to be really careful with this material and this huge responsibility of reflecting to an audience as accurately as we could and as sensitively as we could, you know, in a very multifaceted way. There were lots of things to consider, and particularly the girls, and being fair to these, you know, individuals that we'd got to know and have these very, you know, sort of amazing creative experiences alongside.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, Kate Fox, I'd love to bring you in here as well to broaden this out a little bit, to talk about, you know, this there's an intersection that we're talking around here, and I'd like to dig into it a little bit more, if I may, about the notion of the autistic girl and kind of what is that, if you like, B, creativity and how that operates within us. And then also the kind of the nature of what we know about autism and the space we're working in. Kate, could you talk to me a little bit about how your autistic creativity feels to you? That's not a weird question.
That's a, in one way, That's like an awful question, isn't it? It's
Yeah, sorry.
awful. But also just the right question at this point. So good. What I've been thinking as I've been hearing kind of about the project again and seeing the film again and having a lovely distance from it actually at the moment and being able to go, wow, that is amazing stuff and amazing work actually. I'm so glad that autistic girls are being heard, and I'm so glad that autistic creativity is being recognised, spaces for it are being developed. And that is leading me to think about my creativity, my journey as an autistic girl and woman. I'm going to say it's been a journey of moving between very blocked creativity, very, very blocked creativity, kind of stuck, frustrated urges to connect, to communicate, to produce. You said, you apologised for the phrase creative product, but actually I was desperate to create creative
Product.
that people might interact with. And when I was very early on at school, so I'm probably talking from the ages of primary school 5 to 10, that was fine. Creative product coming out my ears, it was that primary school. The spaces were somehow there. And then around 10 and certainly into teenage years, the spaces were not there for my autistic creativity. And I think those spaces are partly about appropriate sensory spaces. It's about having people who might in some way receive what I had to create and who I felt safe with, who I could trust. I suppose we would say a community of practice. And actually, that's what these workshops are building for the girls, safe spaces, communities of practice. I certainly didn't have that through my secondary school years. Didn't really have that at university, apart from in moments. I joined the drama group. I put on my own plays and wrote them. And this blocked creativity would be freed up temporarily because I had found a space and I'd found the right sensory environment. I'd found my tribe. Then it would get blocked again. In my 20s, I trained as a radio journalist. There would be moments where it would be, I would find a space where I could go off and make a radio show and no one would interfere and I could be as quirky as I wanted. And then other moments where I was, again, blocked, and it would be a case of, Kate, do a minute's news bulletin, and it has to be within these parameters, and it felt uncreative. It wasn't until I got to the age of 30, I became a poet. I say I became a poet as if that just happened, as if I just woke up one morning. Oh, I'm a poet, it's amazing. No, of course, I found a community of practice. I found I went to a creative writing workshop, found my space, and at that point achieved a consciousness, a greater consciousness that I think maybe some of these girls might already have or have developed as part of their consciously autistic identity, a consciousness around what the conditions might be in which I would have that free-flowing creativity. And I suppose my past 15 years as a professional writer, performer, showmaker, facilitator have generally been developing greater awareness of what those conditions are. Only in the last 3 or 4 years, explicitly thinking about the role of autism and being autistic, but actually I was already working on that. So in extreme summary, my life, I promise
Extreme summary.
Extreme summary. My journey has been a journey between very blocked, frustrated creativity and free-flowing, joyous creativity, often within safe structures. And it's really exciting to see that it's possible. There are ways to develop that for people at a young age. Wow, I wish I'd had that.
I find it so interesting actually, because we're talking about a very different experience, aren't we? Because, those of us who are adult diagnosed autistic, creative, female identified individuals grew up not knowing we were autistic and therefore not necessarily knowing how to accommodate our own needs. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that loads of us worked against our own needs in attempts to mask or attempts to do things the way that we thought they should be done. And it seems to me that one of the things we're learning about autistic people in general, but I think we're seeing it very acutely in autistic girls, is how crucial creativity is to self-identity and their ability to function. And yet, you know, like my diagnostic process, which I have to say in brackets was pretty terrible on a whole number of levels, but the very closing statement of my psychologist was, I definitely think you're autistic, but what puzzles me is how creative you are, because we know that autistic people are not creative. I don't know who this we is. Yeah, fingers down a blackboard. Sonia, can you dive in here, because you are, I mean, I think you've been working through a process of how to embody neurodivergent or autistic creativity recently. Can you talk a little bit about what you've discovered through your kind of investigative process?
Do you mean my own project, my own new
Yeah,
project?
I'm thinking
Yeah.
about your work. Yeah, because actually
Okay.
you know, that seems to be something you've really turned your sights on recently, actually.
Yes, it has. And I spent all of my career as a visual artist saying, oh, but my subject's not autism. I had a very clearly defined idea about what my subjects were, and they weren't about autism. So why have I turned to this now? And I think I really identify with what Kate is saying, and I think you've just summarized my life really. Times and places where I've been able to flow and find the outlets for my creativity, and periods of being very, very blocked. So I think that is definite. But what I've been finding really as I've gone along my journey, having been diagnosed now for 5 years, is that it started to feel like a false separation to keep my neurodivergence out of my art practice. And I see I hate the word journey, but I failed to find another word, but my journey through this diagnosis, because it really is, what I'm really conscious of for late diagnosed people is I think this is a huge moment when you self-discover, and it can happen over a period of time, but that what happens thereafter is that you need to somehow get through to a more genuine identity. You need to be able to find more spaces. You hunger for those spaces where you can flow. You need to be able to say very boldly and openly what your needs are, because they're very different. If you keep on confining yourself and making yourself small to fit in, this is no way to have any kind of life, in my view, not a happy, fulfilled, creative life. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in my own practice, and it's a search for congruence, and a congruent identity is what I call it. But I think what's fascinating is, as a professional, I'm also a consultant and a mentor around neurodivergence and creativity. And I've recently been a part of a project which has sought to survey nationally neurodivergent creatives. And some of the findings from that survey, which is John Adams' Congress survey, it's an Arts Council funded project, are coming out with all sorts of findings around the huge importance of creativity to us. And that when we, you know, it's kind of seems to be neurodivergent creative practitioners embody their practices. They live their practices. It is part of who we are. It is how we express our being. It's not a day job. I'm sure a lot of creatives will say that. I'm sure a lot of neurotypical creatives might say, well, okay, well, that's me too. But this really did come out of the survey that somehow this is a very natural thing to us.
And yeah, and it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, we're coming to terms with knowing that we're creative and kind of almost intrinsically creative. And I think for loads of us, creativity has been a life raft, actually, that we've clung to, which is how it becomes so intrinsic with our identity. Like it's the thing that we have needed in order to sort of stay afloat, if that's not unfair. Can I turn a little bit to the gender issue here? Because I know that I think loads of people in the audience will be twitching actually at the term autistic girls. And I know that, you know, it's a very complex thing, this, isn't it, when we start to talk about autism and gender. In fact, like, in the green room, the Zoom green room before, Sonia, you asked about putting pronouns up, and that's a question that I personally always dread, specifically as an autistic person, because I actually really struggle with the pronouns she and her if they are delivered to me assuming that I'm neurotypical. I'm really comfortable with saying I'm an autistic woman, but the general term woman and also mother and girl, and teen have always sat incredibly uncomfortably with me, because I don't feel like those. Kate, you're nodding furiously. Would you like, what's your experience of being an autistic girl, woman, whatever?
Yeah, well, until you said that, I hadn't clicked actually that I am also fine with autistic girl and woman while being aware of the problematics around that, but not around the universalizing girl, woman, teen, because actually at the moment it still feels like there's an important distinction to be made around gender and presentation, because actually what we're fighting against, what we're working against, what we're resisting so often still is a medicalized paradigm which is still quite insistent that there are 4 times more autistic males than females. So it's actually quite a resistant position to say I'm an autistic woman, even though you are then potentially treading on the toes of people who would also struggle greatly to say they're an autistic woman or man. Apropos of nothing, I've just bought a camper van today, and my camper van is definitely gender fluid, and it's really interesting. I'm like, wow, I'm so certain about that. I'm very certain, in a way that I'm not able to be as certain about myself. Anyway, sorry, throw that.
Maybe that, yeah, I know, I agree. I think maybe this, we're pointing to the research team that next is the next direction. I think I would love to know more about how gender operates within autism. We know that people who are autistic are more likely to be transgender than the general population, or non-binary. We know that there's a high proportion of gay people in the autistic community. I think there's some really interesting stuff here, but yet I also still think that autistic girl is a kind of meaningful category. Actually, I feel like Nicola, would you mind coming in here a little bit to talk a bit about that in the project? Because I know this is out of the running order, but I know that's something that's been thought about an awful lot, isn't it? And it's a chewy issue.
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult issue. So much so that we actually changed the title of the project. In fact, when we got our peer reviews, the term female autism had been used in the title, and 2 of the peer reviewers picked up on it. And I, in my response, asked for permission to change the title to remove female autism from the title. And I do remember Kate saying something about that close to the time or shortly afterwards about, well, it makes it sound as if it's a thing, doesn't it? and that kind of, that it didn't feel right. So what we've tried, so we had to make a decision somehow though to identify what the focus of the project was, and we were very good at identifying what the focus of the project wasn't, as in, and what do we call this, it wasn't the stereotypes of autism. There is this large group, and it's not just girls and women, because there are some boys and there are some men who have heard us talk and have said, I identify with the way in which you're talking about this experience, these identities and this experience. We have got we have made huge efforts to be inclusive of what we refer to as marginalised gender identities in the steering group, in our advisory board, in our networks. I'm actually, at the end of this, I'm going to invite Annette to say something about this, because she's she's closely associated with the project, one of our senior practitioners, and she talks really well about this issue, and she's really challenged me about it on numerous occasions. But so we ended up focusing on girls because we're working with 11 to 16-year-olds. The schools, the parents and the girls decide if they're going to participate. And all I can say is, in the end, thinking about this, I drew up a chart, and it basically, it was, here's the stereotypical sort of ontology of autism, and here's this alternative ontology that we're using. So basically, the stereotype is lacks empathy. What we're hearing, what we're working with, is a group who are highly empathic to the feelings of others, almost to the point that it hurts. Feelings of other people are felt so intensely that it can actually be really painful. The stereotype is rigid and restrictive behaviour, whereas actually in this alternative group, it's kind of like fascinations, grand obsessions, intense interests, but I don't see any rigidity. Apart from, you know, repetitive behaviour. That's a creative delight in stimming that a lot of, and Annette's actually done some really important research on that. A really crucial one is meltdown. People talk about meltdown, but actually with the groups that we're working with, you have shutdown more frequently. And this isn't another set of binary oppositions, because it will shift, it's fluid between the two. But I'm talking about what the stereotype is and what some of the differences are in relation to that stereotype that can still be called autistic. And then, of course, there's the social communication difficulties. Well, we've got social creativity. And I think masking is part of social creativity, but, you know, it's I don't recognise social communication difficulties in some of the girls that we're working with, because they're very, very good communicators, often at some cost. So is it okay, Annette, if I just bring you in here to talk about the your because you've done a lot of work on this as well, haven't you?
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I'm one of the practitioners on the project. And I'm doing my thesis looking at women, non-binary and trans people's experience, or all women and non-binary people's experience of being autistic through live art and visual art. And yeah, I definitely have challenged Nikki about the gender issue. I mean, actually, she asked me to do a introduction of myself for the online training, and they said, the script said something like, your daughter will meet me in one of the Zoom sessions or online. And I thought, I don't want to say daughter, because some of these children might be non-binary or identify not as a woman or a girl. And I just said your child. So I definitely try to use non-gendered language as much as possible. I think autistic people experience a lot of the world differently. And for the longest time, autistic research has focused on kind of a hegemonic or male bias kind of presentation of autism. And actually, autistic people are just as varied and wide and different as non-autistic people. So you're going to have lots of different type of people that relate to the world and perceive the world in different ways within the autistic community. And there'll be men that are highly empathetic and feel empathy to extreme. You know, there'll be women that are incredible systemizers, you know, just like there is in the non-autistic community. So I think that's incredibly important, that, you know, there's not this binary of autistic people are all the same. We're actually very varied, but we also have lots in common. And yet, I think ultimately for me, I'm constantly fighting the gender, because I during my research, I discovered that actually, if I had had the choice at 20, that I would have identified as non-binary. I think it's much more complicated now at 49, but I usually use the pronouns she, they. So it kind of, and I didn't even know you could do that. Some young people told me, yeah, you can do that.
Did
I'm
you
like,
see the
"Oh,
response
cool."
from me and Kate? We were like, oh, we could, oh, it's she,
Ooh,
they,
yeah.
that's a new option. And Annette, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna just ask you to round up, because we are so compressed for time. But
No problem.
what I love is about what's coming across is that this is a this is a project that's been full of people challenging each other, and I do think that's an interesting thing to note about the model of research, that actually there's a sort of dialectic going on almost, any certainties seem to be undermined, and it's really interesting to be at that point in research about autism where everything is floating up in the air, and we're beginning to unlearn the things we thought we knew, which I think is so important. Thank you so much for jumping in without any prep. That's really kind of you. Kate, so I'm going to invite you to read a poem to kind of close the main section of this in a moment, but can I just say to the audience, there will be a Q&A after Kate's reading, and so please do stay around for that. We're going to run over the hour a little bit to make sure we've got space for some questions. If you haven't managed to send in a question yet but would like to ask one, please do go to your email, and you'll find on the Zoom confirmation email that you got, you'll find Ollie's email address, and so please do email in a question. He's going to be collating those for us in a moment. Thank you to the fantastic panel. That's been absolutely illuminating. Nikki is advertising your book right now, if anyone can see. She's waving a copy of The Oscillations at us, absolutely on cue. Kate, over to you. I'd love to hear your poem.
Thanks, Catherine. And I now realise The Oscillations refers to exactly that blocked flowing creativity I talked about. This is called what could be called communication, partly about trees, partly about autistic people. You might find them staying near the walls or clutching their earphones, rocking from foot to foot and looking just above their audience. They might be wincing at sirens, saying pardon a lot in crowds, clutching the rails on angled walkways, wondering at the calm faces of everyone else. Sometimes they rest a foot on a crossed ankle in such a way that others will click love in recognition when one of them writes a Facebook post about it. They might have coloured lenses or squint perpetually into the sun. They think everyone can see the fluorescent lights humming. Their eyes dart or fix, so they might be called evasive or invasive. They're stroking a finger, twiddling with their hair, tearing up paper, something in a mesmerising rhythm. They do not always recognise each other, though are often to be found clustered around tea urns, outside where it's quiet, in the toilets, at parties, in wombs and rooms where everybody shares the same nose because of those contagious genes. So they can perpetuate their tangents and straight lines, build forests of themselves, sending micellar releases of carbon and water to those who need them, survival tips, encouragement, warnings, impulses of sound and light.
Sorry, everyone, I lost my mouse then. Thank you, Kate. That was absolutely wonderful and so apposite for this particular moment. We couldn't have planned it more perfectly, I think. Ollie, I'd like to hand over to you now to manage the Q&A, because that's not on my list of responsibilities for tonight. So it's
Okay.
I get to listen now instead.
Okay, great. So at the moment, we've only had one question, but it's quite involved. So and I think it's aimed at everybody, really. The research is being carried out with Limpsfield Grange, as we know, the only school for autistic girls in the country. Do you think that the research findings will be skewed by the fact that your cohort is a very select group of young people who receive extraordinary support from an extraordinary school? Asking as someone who works with autism and creativity professionally, as well as being the parent of two autistic teenage girls who have been poorly supported by their mainstream school, with significant impact on self-esteem and mental health. So that is the question that we have so far.
Shall I start and then hand over? We're not just working with Limpsfield Grange School. So Limpsfield Grange is the partner school. We spent the first year in that school developing the programme of workshops. They actually have a very diverse group of girls, and yes, it's a very specialist environment. But we then have been taking the workshops into different educational settings. So we're working in selective schools, in comprehensive schools with units, and also in special schools. So there's actually a very wide range of educational settings that we're working in. Emma, do you want to say any more about that?
Yeah, so, I mean, one thing that we are very interested in is kind of how the girls make sense of themselves within the different contexts. See how that, you know, how that makes a difference depending on the peers they're with. You know, if they're in a kind of specialist setup where they're with other autistic girls, or whether they're in a mainstream where you know, where they're kind of you know, there's the sort of neurotypical girls, and how they make sense of themselves in you know, depending on who their peers are. And the interviews have suggested that it is very different depending on the context they're in. It really does impact on how they make sense of themselves and the autism. So that's definitely something that we're kind of exploring further, and that we're interested in.
I mean, I think it's fair to say, maybe I shouldn't be saying this, Emma can be very cross with me afterwards, but we have got some evidence to show that because at Limpsfield autistic girls are with autistic girls in a community of autistic girls, that they are on the whole more positive about their autistic identities and that changes as school progresses. But it also makes a huge difference within the different schools about how the teachers work with the children, how they, sorry, not children, how with the girls, but how they perceive what their relationship to autism is. So some of the TAs that are working with the girls are autistic themselves and very open about that, and that's fantastic. So, you know, we are seeing some really good practice and meeting some amazing people. Some of whom have chosen to do this work because they want to be good, positive role models for people like themselves.
Okay, while all these great answers have been given, we've had some more questions. And indeed a comment which says, just to say this has been fabulous, beautifully curated, thoughtful, probing, nuanced, and pretty damn inspiring. Huge thanks to everyone and to you as host. I didn't make that last bit up, by the way. I don't really think I'm the host. Anyway, so then we have some questions. Nicola said that many autistic girls are very good communicators, sometimes at their cost. Please, can you elaborate, explain what you mean by this?
Some, not all, because yeah, it's so hard to generalize. But when I say at their cost, some girls will appear to be communicating very articulately about their preferences, their differences, but actually they're masking what they really think or feel. And that masking might be conscious or unconscious, because so many adolescent autistic girls are trying to fit in, feel pressure to be the same as everyone else, and masking their differences. And we have noticed, and there is actually a little bit of research about this, that a lot of autistic girls are actually very good actors, and a lot of them are in drama schools. So yes, they are very good communicators. You may have noticed, and thank you for that really positive feedback, but there's been some very, very good communication this evening from people who identify as autistic. So that sort of speaks for itself. But when I say at cost, that process of internalizing, consciously or unconsciously, because sometimes it's a deliberate strategy to protect yourself, and sometimes the autistic people are not even aware that they're doing it. It becomes natural. It becomes natural to be unnatural. I call it neurotypicality is a performative act. So thanks, Judith Butler. I'm sorry, I shouldn't talk about Judith Butler in a forum like this. I apologise, but some of you will know what I mean. And so the cost is internalizing and actually shutting down thinking and feeling states, which can lead to what psychologists call internalizing disorders, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, all sorts of things like that. So that's what I mean at cost.
Okay, That was a great answer. Thank you very much. So we have a couple more questions. So the first one, I mean, I'm sort of hesitant to put this. If you'll see why when I read it out, not necessarily to be answered by the panel, but in general, how can we be more involved with projects relating to this? All of this has been absolutely relevant to my own experiences. I thought the reason I'd read it out is because other people may feel the same. Nikki, are there things that people can do to get involved in this work?
I've got a complete other things that people can do because I've just spotted Damien at the bottom there, and he's desperate to ask a question. So I'm just going to say at some point, let's say Damien's question because it'll be a really tough one.
I
But
do have a question, but it's more a quick comment. Was the email I got from Oliver was from a no reply Zoom link, so people may be wanting to ask questions and not having a way of doing so.
Just to clarify, it's not that you're absolutely right. Within the text of the email, it has my email address contained within it, I believe.
okay. Right, team, come on, help me. How can people get involved? Yes, Melissa.
Am I mute?
Are you?
No.
Yeah, now you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the online resources, Nikki, are going to be available, are they not, more widely, if that's what the question's getting at, to have more access to the work. Was that what the question meant?
Well,
I'm sorry.
yeah, they're not going to be available until we've sort of made sure that they're okay. So they're being
Well,
tried.
I mean, long term is
Yeah,
the
but
plan.
long term, yeah. Actually, one of the things that we're doing is we want to create some kind of resource for what we call the gatekeepers, GPs, teachers, parents, which will identify what would be kind of a resource that will help people to recognize when a young person maybe when that conversation might happen, that actually, do you think you might be autistic, or even better, that young people recognize themselves as autistic, and think, that's like me. And the way that we think that could be done is not necessarily. I mean, I want to bring Emma in because Emma and I have had quite a lot of discussion about this, about what do GPs need? Why has this gone on for so long? That there's this kind of generations of women who have then who've fallen under the radar and then ended up getting a diagnosis much later in life. And actually, and I'm talking for Emma now, so I'm going to bring her in. But one of the things we think is that there's a kind of listening to the stories that are being told from these girls and these women is really important. There are a kind of set of characteristics that could be drawn up, but there's actually some really kind. I mean, we're wondering about doing a different version of the film which would collate some of these stories that could then be used in training. We've got a new medical school at Kent. We could then develop that into a training resource for GPs and for teachers, with a kind of animation attached. But Emma, over to you as to how you think we can create things that how the research can be disseminated and how it can be spread more widely, if that's what the question is getting at, which I think it is.
Well, no, just in relation to what you're talking about, Nikki. I mean, it is an issue that the very diversity makes it difficult to recognise, and we're thinking it's not, it's not going to help us coming up with, and there are already kind of lists out there of characteristics, because it's how does a GP recognise, that this young person in front of them, might have autism. How does a teacher recognise it? How does a parent? And I think because we are kind of very, we make stories about ourselves. That's how we recognise things. It's kind of, I think that might be a useful resource to help kind of those gatekeepers perhaps recognise it, recognise earlier that this young person needs help and support of a certain kind. So one part of our research is that we are sort of talking, we are wanting to bring in stakeholders, parents and teachers and GPs to sort of help us kind of understand what are the barriers and what would help in that kind of recognition process. So that's one way people could get involved. Maybe if there's some way we put out there for people to contact us, if they could help in some way in that sense.
And we collate all of those stories as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, there is more follow-up from this, but I'm going to deal with some of that via email, sort of putting people in touch with each other, if that sort of makes sense. I did want to read this out. Can I just say this has been amazing. Your research is so needed and being done so brilliantly with not just about autistic girls. I've got a bit teary during this session. I think that's a really nice comment. There's a comment here that I'm going to read straight from the email. No questions from me, but when Nikki was talking about empathy, that was often felt so very viscerally for autistic girls, as though they were experiencing increased cognitive empathy. I thought of the neurological condition mirror touch synesthesia. People feel a physical sense of touch on their own bodies when they witness touch to other people and often to objects. I thought it might be interesting as a condition that aligns or perhaps overlaps. Thank you to all for such a great event. So that is all the questions we have, I think. So I'd just like to finish off by thanking everybody involved. I think it's been an absolutely brilliant event. Thank you for the audience. Thank you for
Damien had a question.
Damien, go for it.
I was struck by the description early on about some of the sensory issues and diversity there being surprising, because to me the sensory issues, the flows, the blocks, all these issues are not surprising to me at all. And so to whom is this surprising and why, was my question.
Yeah, I can start this off and then Emma might come in. I think it's surprising because from as far as I'm aware, research is slightly lagging behind in the sensory importance for autistic people. So I think it's only in the latest revision of the DSM that they've brought in the sensory needs as an impact. And I think for me, as a neurotypical person, it was also surprising to hear the stories from the girls about the extreme reactions that I, as a researcher, I was just unaware of, because I hadn't come across this in terms of research that I'd read. So that's why sort of that side of thing personally surprised me. I don't know if Emma wants to contribute anything else in terms of from a research perspective. But also, sorry, I should add on that these are we're giving the space for autistic people to describe in kind of detail and really listen to the way they articulate their sensory experiences, which I don't think is necessarily always heard, for example, by the schools or by peers and people like that. So it's trying to find a platform where they can tell us their stories, and then we can provide more information to people who may be unaware of their experiences in relation to the senses.
Kind of strikes me as an important part of the double empathy problem, that sensory experience. So to the autistic viewer, it's highly resonates and yeah, this is what it's like. And to the non-autistic viewer, even those trained in the area and so on, it's surprising. So it's kind of very important message that to try and break down some of that divide.
Yeah, absolutely, I absolutely agree. And I think what's
stories, I would agree with the others about the stories being powerful and ways of telling those stories.
And I think it's important to acknowledge, as, and this is just beyond me personally, but as a wider project, we're kind of consistently learning from the autistic community, not only the participants that we're working with, but we've got an autistic steering group, we've got autistic consultants. So it is a continual learning process. So we are learning as we go, and then sort of changing, for example, methodology. So incorporating different questions from the participants that we're working with as well. But yeah, I completely agree, it is that double empathy. But for example, the the example I gave in relation to the paper, the girls were often told off or deemed as not doing their homework or not fully engaging in school by the teachers or the academic staff, and in fact they wasn't communicated to them, or it wasn't realised by the teachers that the issue was fundamentally with the sense of the literal paper and being unable to turn the pages, therefore being unable to use the book. And I remember having a conversation with that particular girl, oh, are you able to use like a Kindle or another electronic way of reading? And they were unable to. So it's about trying to get these stories out there so that teachers and other people, researchers, are aware of these differences. And it's not necessarily that someone doesn't want to do the work or is incapable, but the sensory issues are so problematic for them that they are unable to, but they for whatever reason haven't communicated or haven't been given the option or the opportunity to communicate those needs.
Okay, I think that is now the end of the event. I think this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you to everybody for taking part. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you to Catherine for chairing so brilliantly and keeping people to time. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thanks for coming. Nick, is there anything you'd like to say by way of finishing off?
Yeah, by way of finishing off, I'm going to ask Melissa and Annette and Hannah and Emma, who were taught how to do this, and Izzy, who I think is also with us somewhere, to teach us how we exit from a Zoom. Okay? Are you ready? Who's going to do the 1, 2, 3? We'll show you what you have to do. You have to find an object or something that you're going to put in front of your camera. Annette, give us the example
Yeah,
of your.
it could be your thumb. And you're just going to cover the camera, and it's a great way to kind of enter the space and exit the space, because a lot of what autistic people find hard is leaving a social situation. We kind of slowly back away and kind of don't know what to do. So if you make a real break, then it's much easier to do that. So if we all kind of take something, it can be a piece of paper, your finger, a toy, I don't know, whatever you want, and cover your screen.
We do it on 1, 2, 3, Annette, or
Yeah.
do you just cover it?
I was just going to say 1, 2, 3, goodbye.
All right, I was going to go 1, 2, 3, cover your cameras.
Yeah, okay.
1,
And
2, 3.
Goodbye.
Bye.
And you can leave now, and no one's going to think you're wrong.
I think Ollie will cut us off.
Bye.